Now, the next class that I want to be able to evaluate inside of the class of writers, inside of the subclasses of writers, inside the concrete classes of writers for character output streams is the FileWriter. So just a very quick overview of this presentation is we'll do an introduction on what the FileWriter class is. We'll look at the class declaration. We'll look at the constructors for FileWriter, its methods, and some sample code. So FileWriter is useful for the following situations. When you want to write text to a specific file, when you want to append text to a file, or if you want to copy text from one file to another. So in all those instances, you might want to use FileWriter. So the FileWriter class is a subclass of the output stream writer class that itself extends the writer class. That's an abstract class. So it implements closable, flushable, appendable, and auto-closable. These are all things that we want to be able to do with our streams. So the general syntax for a FileWriter is it's a concrete class, so a public class FileWriter that extends another concrete class output stream writer. And we're going to ensure that we implement all of these interfaces so we get those methods, that we get that membership into. So our hierarchy would look something like this. Our FileWriter is inside the IO package, and it extends the output stream writer, which is itself a concrete class inside of the IO package. And so that extends the writer abstract class, which extends the object class. So the constructor, so let's look at some of the FileWriter constructors. Let's look at one where we can pass in a reference to a file object. So we can have a file data type. And so we would construct a FileWriter on top of that file data type using the default char set. So the syntax of this would look something like this. We could say, for instance, have a path or a file name that includes its path as a string, and then we can construct a new file object that we save, and then we can pass that file object around our FileWriter. An alternative way is we can pass a file descriptor data type into the FileWriter constructor, and that would use the platform's default char set. A third way is we could pass a file data type in, just like we saw previously, but as a second parameter, we can pass in a Boolean value, something either true or false, that defines whether we're going to create an append mode or not. So if append is true, that second parameter is true, then the contents of the pre-existing file will be preserved and the output is appended to the end of the file. And if it's false, then it's what we saw previously, where the pre-existing file that has that same name will be completely destroyed, and any content we write to it will be the new content that's in that file. So the syntax for this constructor, if we want to sample, would look like this. We would create a new file object, and that file object as a parameter in that constructor would be the file name, and then here we can get a reference of it. And the first constructor, in the first parameter in the constructor, I'd pass in a reference to the file, and the second parameter would be true. I want to append to that file, not completely overwrite it. I can also have as a constructor, as the first parameter, a file data type, and as the second parameter, a character set, which is the encoding, how I want to encode the contents for that file. If I want to use something beyond the default. A fifth parameter that we have is, again, we can pass in a file data type. And as a second parameter, I can pass in the character set if I don't want to use the default character set. And then as a third parameter, it could be that Boolean value of whether I want to append, which means keep, preserve the pre-existing content in that file, or if that's false or not there at all, then it would destroy the pre-existing contents of that file and just overwrite into it. And that happens immediately. I don't have to do any write methods. Just by constructing it, I would be destroying whatever is in that method. I'm sorry, whatever's in that original file. As a sixth form of the constructor, we can do what we have been doing and just use a string that defines the pathway or the file name of a file, of the file that either exists or that we want to write, because if it doesn't exist, we will author it, we will write it out. And again, if we, by default, if this already exists, if this file name already exists, we'll destroy it, we'll overwrite it with a brand new one with empty contents when we initially create this. So again, what this would look like is we can create a new file writer and just pass in the string that has the name of the file we want to write. Now, just like before, though, if we want to preserve the contents of a file, if we want to have existing content carry over, after I give the file name in the form of a string, I can give a Boolean value, true or false, for the append mode. And if append is true, then we will preserve the pre-existing content. Otherwise, we'll overwrite it. So this is an example of what that would look like. New file writer, the file name, and then the second parameter would be true. And then again, just like the other constructors, we can pass in the file name as a string and the char set. So if we don't want to use the default encoding, but use some custom coding, we can pass in the encoding as a second parameter. And since that is the second parameter, if you want to use the string file name as the reference of the file that gets passed in, then the second parameter would then be the character set if you're not using the default character set, which means the third parameter would be your Boolean, your append mode in the form of a Boolean. So whether you want to maintain pre-existing content or destroy it. So the FileWriter class constructor internally creates a file output stream to write bytes to, right? So that handles that for us. And so with the help of its superclass output stream writer, it converts the Unicode characters written to the stream into bytes using the default encoding. So the FileWriter methods class does not define, the FileWriter class does define any methods of its own. This should be does not define any methods of its own. It simply inherits them from its superclass. So the methods, which we've already covered in both writer and output stream writer, but just to highlight that they exist, are going to be flush, get encoding, write, all the write methods that are overloaded. So you get that from output stream writer, and then from the writer class, we got all the different append methods that are overloaded, the close and an all writer, and 2 writer methods. So we have a total of 5 different writer methods that either come from writer or output stream writer. So let's create a simple program where we'll write some text into a file, and we'll use that write method that we inherited from the writer class. And so here's a very simple application, as you can see. It's only a couple lines of code along with the output from both the console and what we would expect to be inside of the output file. So, and an explanation, but just like before, what I want to do is I want to look at this in IntelliJ. So I have my writer tester, now my file writer tester here. So let's take a look at this. So I'm going to import my file writer. I'm going to import my IO exception. I'm going to create a class, file writer tester 1, that has a main method. I'll just have my main method throw the IO exception so I can focus on having my source code here. So I'm going to use the constructor where I can just pass in the path, the string of the path and name of my file. So we're going to call this myfile.txt. I'm only going to use this, I'm not going to use the append mode. So if this file exists, which it does, it will go ahead and overwrite it. But you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and delete it anyway. But I don't have to do that because it would overwrite it anyway when it goes to create this file writer. Now, once I have this file writer, I'm going to go ahead and just call its write method and pass a string into it. Welcome to, computer science, and the new line character. And if I don't do the new line character, it would be like concatenating 2 strings on top of each other inside the file. There wouldn't be a new line. Then I'll do another string, I love Java programming, and then I'll close. And then on the console, if I don't throw an exception, I'll print to the console successfully written, and let me run that. And then inside the file itself, this my file, which I've just generated by running the code, I should now have those two strings. Welcome to UNO Computer Science, and I love Java programming. Okay, let's look at another sample program here where we take a string array and write that to a file just so we can kind of vary it up. So again, just a very simple application. All the output is on the slide with a quick explanation, but let's actually go ahead and look at this. FileWriter tester 2 here. So I'm going to import my FileWriter. I'm going to import my IO exception. I'm going to create my example class here, FileWriter tester 2. I'm going to create a main method that throws an IO exception if we generate one. So inside of this main method, I'm going to create a string array with an initializer list effectively that is my 4 strings. This is a dog, this is a cat, this is an elephant, this is a lion. Here I'm going to create a FileWriter using the string parameter that is the file name. And this exists, right, from our last example, but I'm not going to manually delete it. I'm going to illustrate that it's going to just overwrite the contents if I don't pass in that second parameter for appending. Here I'll create a for loop that will loop over each of the elements inside of that array. So we'll start at index 0 and hit until we go to the end of the length of that array. So I'm going to index into the array and write that string. And then I'll put a new line character after each one. Otherwise, each string would be on the same line. And then I'll close. So effectively, I'm doing the exact same thing I did last time, but I'm using iterable logic, right, to iterate through my array and be able to go ahead and write each value into the file. So I successfully read, which means I didn't generate any exceptions. And if I now go back to my file, look, I've destructively overridden it. So I've lost the previous content, and now I have the contents from that array. And so there's just one last example I'd like to show with FileWriter tester. I want to show how we can write from a file to a file. So I'm going to create a simple program where we copy lines of text from one file into another file. And so the input file is going to have this lines of text. We'll actually examine it in the code. Again, just very simple application. Like, that's the nice thing about these classes inside of IO, is that we can do these very powerful processes that's been abstracted into just some simple method calls. And then the expected output and an explanation. This explanation, I tried to go a little bit deeper in the slides. But let's take a look here at the actual source code. So I'm going to import file because I want to do this in a different way than what we've been doing. So we'll actually import the file class from the java.io package. I'm also going to go ahead and get a file reader and file writer from the IO package. We've already talked about reader. We're examining writer now, and I'm going to grab the IO exception. I'm going to have inside of my application class here, FileWriter tester 3, a main method, and that's going to throw the IO exception. I'm going to create a new file data type. And remember, one of the parameters we can pass to a new file is the location of the file. So as a string, so input.txt, so that's the name of our file, including the path. A relative path is what I'm using, and I'm going to save that into a file instance called infile. I'm going to create another file instance that is an output.txt, and so I'm going to go ahead and save that into another file instance. And then using that file, I'm going to create a file reader around that first file, that in file, call that FR for file reader. And then I'm going to create a file writer around that second file instance, out file, and I'll call that FW, short for file writer. Now I'm going to create a loop control variable that is a character. I'm going to read a character at a time from my file reader. until I hit -1. Recall that -1 is the sentinel value that represents the end of a file. And I'll take each of those characters and I will write that onto my file writer. When I'm done that process, I'm going to close my file reader and my file writer. Remember to always close every stream that you've opened. And so here, I'm not printing anything to the console, so my console is blank. I had my input file. Let's see what my input file was. Here, I had input.txt. This is an orange. This is an apple. This is an orange. This is a papaya. This is a mango. And now if I go to my output.txt, we can see that this is an apple. This is an orange. This is a papaya. This is a mango. So we're able to copy from here to here. Excellent. So if I were to visualize that process, this is the contents of my end file. I would then feed that into the file reader stream, where I can then use the read method to access that in my program. And then in my program, I can then call the write method on the file writer stream to load the content into the file writer, which then saves that into the destination of the file object inside of our output.txt. So that's this kind of like a diagram of what's happening in that read-write chain. And that's it. That's effectively how FileWriter works. Very, very powerful class for being able to write characters or text into files from your Java applications. Excellent.